Hi everyone, Dr. Rochelle Haynes here from Crowd Potential Consulting Inc. And I am happy to be sharing this presentation with you and so glad you've come to listen to my session. So thank you so much. So this session is going to be all about GigHR, which is a framework for empowering our blended and remote workforces. So in that presentation, we're going to talk a little bit more about what we mean by a blended workforce and how that differs from a remote workforce. But I'll get a bit more into that session, that as we go along this session. So a little bit about myself. I call myself a gig HR expert and a good work advocate. And what that really means is that I am passionate about creating a good work experience for everybody, which is what led me to this area. Looking at how persons that work in an atypical way can also experience a good quality of work as well. So we'll get a little bit more into that into the presentation. So I've told you that I'm the founder and CEO of Crowd Potential Consulting. I'm also a senior lecturer at the University of the West of England. And also I'm a podcaster and a YouTuber. How millennial is that? And my podcast is called Remotely Speaking Up. And on that podcast, you can find out all things about remote work and how we can enable businesses, countries, and individuals to do that better. All right, so let's jump into it. Oops, just need to go down one slide. Here we go. So, this is just our agenda for our presentation. I'm going to lay out the context a bit more in terms of what are the drivers of remote work. We're very familiar with COVID-19 and what's going on currently, but this has been a silent revolution that's been going on for a while. A lot more workers have been opting to work in the non-traditional fashion. And we're going to look at what have been some of the drivers of that over the years. Then we're going to get in a little bit more into the gig economy. What do we mean by the gig economy? Who makes up the gig economy? And what type of work can we do there? And then that's going to lead us into some of the challenges that we typically face when we're hiring persons that are not full-time with the company, but still work with the company in some capacity. And then from there, we're going to go on to outline the Gig HR framework and the research that led to that. So we'll talk a bit more about the research first, and then we'll speak about the Gig HR framework itself and how that can help us to better engage people that work not only remotely, but who are not full-time members of the organization or not members at all of the organization. How do we manage persons that are independent alongside our in-house teams? So remotely or otherwise, we'll get into that. Then, to wrap it off, we'll talk about, okay, where do you go from here? How do we actually implement the gig framework? And that's where I'll just outline some of the resources that my consulting company offers in terms of how companies can actually implement this plan and initiate this process. So, let's get going. So I thought just before we really got into the meat of the presentation that we should define a few key terms. So we hear a lot of these terms being thrown around, and sometimes we're not quite sure about what is the difference or the distinction between them. And a typical phrase would be independent workers or contingent workers and digital nomads. So I've separated them here to just make it very clear what's the difference between them. So with regards to our independent or contingent workers, we're speaking about anybody who is self-employed. It could either be in a professional capacity or it could be a more, let's say, domestic skill related. Depends on how they offer that skill and on through what means. So they usually typically work remotely, and they usually use digital tools to communicate. So you'll find these persons are the ones that tend to make up the gig economy primarily. You also find that not all these people work through gig platforms. So that's why we have this just wide category of independent workers. So within that category, that can be entrepreneurs, that can be gig workers, those who work through gig platforms, and also making up a subset of that category would be digital nomads, our second block. And when we're talking about digital nomad, we're talking about those persons that work They're independent workers as well. Some also can be full-time, so this is where it gets a bit confusing. But the main criteria here for a digital nomad is that they're location free. They're not bound to any one office or location or country or cafe or however they choose to work. And they typically tend to work from location to location. So this could be somebody who might be in Thailand for 3 months working and then in Bali for another 3 months working. That's the usual luxurious scenario that we hear about with digital nomads. Or it could just be somebody working from one cafe down the street and switching to another cafe around the corner. So once their primary means of working is through a digital, let's say, tool and from different locations, that makes them a digital nomad. And then we know the typical subset of workers, which is our permanent workers. So think your full-time staff and also part-time staff, those who tend to have a more long-term relationship with the company, and as a result they enjoy certain employment-related benefits. And then we have, culminating the full set, the blended workforce. And the blended workforce you can see as a mixture of all three of these and more. So we're talking about your permanent staff mixed in with your independent staff, mixed in with those who are working online, those who are working offline, those across different generation gaps, different genders, different communication means, whatever the process. And more recently, it's also been robots. And it sounds very back to the future to say, but in a lot of Asian countries, you already have humans working alongside robots. And in many of our own countries, there's a lot of automation already that humans help to also maintain and facilitate or work alongside. So the blended workforce consists of all of those mixes. It's really bringing, how do we start to think about where your workforce has changed so dynamically, where you now are presented with this blend of different types of workers. What are the things that we really need to do to make sure we can help them to be as effective and engaged as possible? So that's our real concern in our presentation as we go along. So hopefully now you're very clear on the different terms that we hear thrown around when we're talking about the gig economy or digital work or remote work. So let's talk a little bit more about what are some of the driving forces behind these changes and behind this rise in atypical work. Why is it all of a sudden there's a lot of conversation around not just working remotely, but working more digitally, working more location independent? So we call this our 5 workplace forces driving the perfect storm for the 2020s. And what we really mean there is that total disruption in the world of work as we know it. And we know already that COVID-19 has accelerated that disruption, but it was occurring already. So let's look at some of the drivers. The first one is digital adoption, and that has really enhanced the ability from persons to work anywhere in the globe. And as I said, with COVID-19, we have people working remotely overnight. A good scenario of how this is sped up was last year I did a presentation in September speaking about remote work within the Caribbean context. And I was told it wouldn't work, it wouldn't happen. Although it was happening in certain spheres already, in smaller spheres. But the general opinion was that remote working was not for the Caribbean. 5 months later, because of COVID-19, the majority of the Caribbean were forced to work remotely or having to deal with the consequences if that wasn't possible within your job. So digital adoption, along with environmental circumstances, in this case, has really been speeding up the change that we're seeing in the world of work. The second force is really when we speak about organization and leadership readiness. It's becoming more and more apparent to organizations that as the context changes, the old style of leadership is no longer as effective as previous times. And that might be to do with how leaders are able to, let's say, coordinate their workforce and motivate their workforce who are now as informed as they are. Typically, leaders, if you think of the traditional structure, leaders at the top, employees at the bottom, and information just coming from the top down, where everyone now has access to the same information, it flips the tables a bit. So that access to knowledge, those technology drivers are among these forces. Then you also have the organizational cultural shift, and that is very much that's very much influenced by the first two steps that we identified as well in terms of digital adoption and organizational leadership readiness. I often say when it comes to digital transformation, it's not just digital transformation that we're talking about, but what that requires, that individuals to interact with technology smoothly and the cultural shift that requires, we should really be talking about whole business transformation. So that cultural shift is definitely a must. Then also think about our talent lens. The more we are exposed and the more access technology gives us to talent from all over the globe, it raises a lot of questions with regards to whether or not there's really a war for talent. How widely are we looking for that talent? And are we really looking with a very diverse lens and are facilitating, let's say, recruitment and sourcing of the best talent from across the globe? We might be missing out on some opportunities. And then, of course, the gig era, these gig platforms that have been completely disruptive to the business world. If you think of the fact that employees can now work primarily through a digital app without ever actually being in contact with their employer, that's something that has only really come to the fore in the last 10 or so years. So that has been very disruptive to the traditional organizational model that we know, and it's really causing requirements are changing the way that we think about management. So let's define the gig economy. What do we mean by the gig economy? What we're talking about here is work that's enabled through online platforms and networks that act as marketplaces where you can buy and sell your services. So if you think of Uber, for example, if you think of Deliveroo, where you go online and you hire a cab or a taxi, and you may never have any actual contact with the company or so forth, but you're accessing their services through this online platform. So that's just an example, but within the gig economy, work can take place in two ways. So you either have that work on demand, so those traditional activities that you perform online are through traditional systems, but they're occurring through specific apps. So going back to what we were talking about, like Uber. And then you also have crowd work, so where you can complete tasks online through these gig platforms. So if you think of, for example, there's an app I used to use called Logo Joy, where you go online, you want to create a logo for your company. Yes, there's somebody working behind the screen to help you generate that logo, but you never have any interface with them. So in this context, you are just working primarily it seems that you're developing your logo yourself via the platform, you pay for it, and then you go. Whereas the main difference here we have between crowd work and work on demand is that work on demand, there might be some physical interaction with the person that's delivering to the service. So think of the Uber driver. Whereas crowd work, it's completely through the platform, and often there's no physical interaction at all. So these companies, they're actually more pervasive than we think. Google, for example, in 2019, this statistic was from 2019, more than 54% of their workforce were actually gig workers. And persons that work on these platforms these would fit in our category of independent workers or contingent workers, because they're not a full-time part of the company, but they're acting almost as entrepreneurs. They're using their platform, using these company platforms to offer their services. So this causes quite a bit of confusion, which we're going to get into in a little bit. So here's just some more examples of some well-known gig firms or gig platforms. We all know about Fiverr and Upwork, where you can go and offer consulting services. So here's a pit stop for you. This is just to check your knowledge. We've talked about all of our key terms. We've talked about the gig economy. So here is just a little test for you. So if you pause with me, I'll go through it with you. So we have here, digital nomads are. So what I'm asking you to think about here is, what is that key defining feature of digital nomads that set them apart from other independent or contingent workers? So I give you a few seconds to think about that. And let's see what we have. What do you think it is? So the main feature we identified earlier was that digital nomads are typically location independent. They work from location to location, country to country, or cafe to cafe. So let's see about question 2. We just spoke about the gig economy, and we said within the gig economy, there are 2 types of work that you can pursue within the gig economy. What do you think those are? Give you a few seconds. Let's see what we have. Oh, third answer came up. Oops, there we go. There goes the suspense. But yeah, in terms of the gig economy work, the 2 main types of work you can offer are crowd work and work on demand. And that third question, I think, was pretty much a giveaway. So it's okay if it's come out a bit early. But that third question, COVID-19 has been an accelerator of the hot topic of the month, or the last few months, remote working. So hopefully you have a good background into the content that we're going to be looking at. Now, let's look at the actual study. So what we noticed after I did my research on the gig economy, and based on my consulting in the area of HR and my academic experience, reading about the HR literature, one of the things that constantly jumped out was the fact that the majority of HR literature, despite all of those changes and driving forces that we identified, still focus on full-time workers. So I thought to myself and my business partner, we came up with a plan, and we said, we need to do a study. We need to find out just how fast, how much the world of work is changing. So we did a global study across 6 regions, and here's the breakdown of the regions that you see here on the left. And what we did was conduct both surveys with workers and companies, company managers, and also interviews with digital nomads and also managers as well, to find out what were the changing ways of working, but also what were changing work expectations. So we wanted to know if the expectations of companies for independent workers were the same as they had for, let's say, full-time employees, and if that clashed with the independent workers' preferred work style or work expectations as well. So we're going to tell you a little bit more about our results, because this is what led into the GigHR framework. So we just have, let's bring that in. We just have 3 of the key findings. And remember, this was pre-COVID. So mind you, this paper was published in February, COVID hit in March. So what we've seen is an acceleration of some of our findings. We said at the time that home working and remote working would be the preferred workspaces in 5 years. We now cut that down to about 2 years. Home is you don't have a choice, but as society is opening back up, we're seeing some people are moving back into the offices. So we still expect that remote working trend to continue as people are now more exposed to it. And we expect one of those spots, not within 5 years, but probably 2 years or less, will be the preferred home working spot. ICs, we have here ICs, that is independent contractors. We said that they will represent 40% of the workforce by 2025. Since COVID, in our study, that's been scaled to 2022. So you can see how COVID-19 has accelerated some of these changes that we predicted or that we saw happening already based on our research. And then we also said that co-working spaces would be the most productive environment for all workers, independent or permanent. So now that we've seen a lot of companies realize that remote working can work, and a lot of companies have chosen to continue with remote working, and a lot more employees are demanding remote working, we're expecting that co-working spaces will become a lot more popular. And what we mean by the co-working spaces, these are locations that you can go in and rent their facilities in order to work. You might get a Skype room, you might get a lounge area, a meeting room and so forth, but it's a work location away from work that's usually a lot more relaxed as well, so it's preferable. So outside of the trends, we also wanted to identify what were the issues for this working population. And what we found as one of the big issues, and we'll come on to the others, but let's look at this one first, was that a lot of things that we typically would try to manage within the physical workspace and for full-time employees were being ignored within the digital context, especially for persons working mainly via these platforms. So here we just have two quotes from our digital nomads that we spoke to in different countries, where they're telling us about the discrimination that they face. One guy, the guy on the left, our friendly guy with the glasses here, he was just telling us about that perception of gig workers as not being as important as other workers. And that is really changing as persons now value remote work more, and they realize that persons across the globe, regardless of how they work, can actually make a significant contribution to the organization. But still, that precarious nature of the gig contractors role within the organization, that puts them in a particularly bad place. But as we come to rely on these workers more, as our companies are made up of more digital workers, of more persons working on a project basis, especially given the economic downturn where some companies can no longer afford a full-time staff, a full bevy of full-time employees, then it is at companies' own peril to treat these employees in a negative way, or to not give them the proper terms and conditions that they should have. We also had another gig worker, or digital nomad in this case, speaking about discrimination she faced in the terms of gender. She said there was a lot of gender bias, and she also faced discrimination around her age. So a lot of these issues that we would typically pay attention to within the full-time space, we tend to ignore within the digital space. So a lot of our digital nomads actually highlighted this as an issue. So here's some more really astounding findings that the study highlighted. The main thing it highlighted was that there is a need for corporate or companies to do better in the way that they manage their independent workers. Not just their independent workers, I would also say their remote workers, because a lot of these persons, some of the persons we spoke to, had full-time contracts with companies, but they worked remotely. So they worked from location to location, never actually interacting with the company. But a lot of these companies, because those workers are not in the physical space, they're really falling behind in the way that they manage them. Falling behind, actually, I don't think they were ever at the starting line, to be fair. So here are a lot of complaints by digital nomads, and valid complaints. For example, there is little formal attraction and recruitment or management process. So often it was a very ad hoc, very unprofessional sort of interaction, which often frustrated a lot of the talent that you were trying to source. 60% of the persons we spoke to, that's quite an astounding figure, they said that their work was really rarely recognized when it was done outstanding. And typically these type of workers are the best of the best. You seek after these independent workers because they're very good at what they do. But more than 60% of them weren't even recognized for the quality of their skill. So you can see the implications there for motivation and retention. Another issue was that there was a lot of variations in the way in which these relationships with these independent workers were managed. One of the issues there was that no one knew who to manage. No one knew who was actually managing them. So was it HR's responsibility? Was it procurement's responsibility? It really raised an issue with the company. We mentioned the issue of discrimination before. Also, a clash between traditional and digital ways of working. So not having the right tools, not thinking about the access that person needs to your team in order to effectively perform the job. Just because that person's out of sight, often the digital worker was treated like they were out of mind as well. So that was a real issue. Also, the area of high-risk contracts. And I think this is going to be a bit of a tricky one within the Caribbean context. Now, navigating what type of contracts and what type of rules and regulations should apply the more we work within the digital economy, particularly via gig platforms. So, this is where we sprung into action. Based on the findings of our study, we thought, well, clearly there's a gap here. We have this new workforce, this increasingly blended workforce, but we're still using the same HR approaches. So we thought we would come up with a framework that really seeks to help organizations to navigate this process of managing this increasingly blended workforce. And as we said with COVID-19 and companies having to scale their full-time employees, you will see an increasing uptake of independent contractors to fill some of those spaces, but at a possibly reduced cost. So here is our framework. We designed this in the shape of a house, and that's because the house conveys a safe space. It conveys a place you can go to feel belonging, to feel a sense of connection and community. So this is what we wanted to convey when it came to looking after all of our workers. And we have here on the left, Gig Shade. So these are some of the things that were currently being experienced by organizations and gigsters or digital workers because they were failing to manage the process properly. So for example, the top-down management, discrimination, micromanagement, lack of flexibility, lack of clarity, these different things. Lack of retention in terms of future job opportunities. And we said, okay, let's start from the ground up. Let's provide a roadmap of how we can build a new or transition the organizational culture to one that's more suited to the current context. And then from there, we designed 4 rooms in our house. These rooms are called Gig Rules, Gig Tools, Gig Skills, and Gig Thrills. And don't say that fast, you're going to bite your tongue. So then from there, we'll get into those rooms in a second. We then sought to make sure that these rooms were covered by that protection and emphasis on well-being, because it's really important as you're trying to, let's say, enhance productivity and performance. Where you're working in a very different context, it's very important to ensure that the employee feels safe and well looked after in order to give up their best. So as we've seen during COVID, mental health has really come to the fore, and for obvious reasons. We're living in a traumatized society, and no one's quite sure when the current situation will end, if it will end. So well-being has really come to the forefront. So that's our roof, which we call Gig Protect, that's particularly important. So once you get through our house and through our rooms, you then come out on the other side to experience all the benefits of effectively managing your gig workforce. So having a growth mindset, making sure you have a workforce that's representative, making sure people feel a sense of belonging and tolerance, empowering your employees, and so forth, agile working. And this is what we call GigHR success. So now let's break our room down a bit more. So we mentioned in terms of building that gig culture, and one of the things that we've said is that this is a whole business transformation. This isn't just HR transformation. This isn't just including some digital tools. This requires an entire business shift. So for that, we need to start from the ground up. Go back to your organizational visions and values. Go back to your behaviors and actions and look and see if they are really inclusive of a blended workforce, or if there are areas that still primarily cater to your, if it might be the whole thing, still primarily caters to your traditional and full-time staff. If you want to create a sense of belonging for the company, you have to make sure your company and all of its statutes communicate that as well. Oh, let's go back. So then we started with our gig rules, because once you have reviewed your vision, possibly revised it where needed, then it's time to actually break that vision down into protocols. What are the new rules of the road? What are the new protocols that are required? So we have that broken down into 5 circles here that leads you to better work execution. And that's thinking about your future working strategy. Where we're talking about widening that talent lens, what does your current workforce look like with all the changes? Where we're saying your talent lens have been widened, where are the new sources that you can now look for work? And how are you building that into your future work strategy in terms of the skills and the expertise that you need? Think about also your blended protocols. What is the process of, let's say, onboarding? What is the process of negotiating terms and conditions for these employees? What are the strategies and the regulations that you will put in place to make sure they feel as welcomed and a sense of belonging, and that they can deliver that job effectively? So that leads on to creating a very positive and inclusive work experience, or what we also call leading into a work habitat that suits every type of employee. It's really, this is why we're going back to that whole idea of whole business transformation, because this might even require, when we mention work habitat here, a complete transformation of your physical space as well. While you're not interacting with these persons physically, all of them, it might still require a change of your physical space in order to accommodate better working between these persons and your full house team, your full-time in-house team. So it's really thinking about the whole organizational infrastructure from the ground up, and how will that change in terms of delivering on that proper work execution. So those are gig rules. What are the rules of the road that you have in place, and how might you think about reshaping your old rules or rewriting your old rules? Oops, backwards. So then we have the tools, very crucial, as we found out during the current pandemic. So it's very important. You have your rules set and so forth. You want to facilitate better working between online staff, offline staff, full-time, part-time, independent, and so forth. Do you have the right digital tools to facilitate that process? What is the system? What is it that your company requires in terms of digital infrastructure and in order to create digital agility? So this requires you to think of your entire touch and tech ecosystem, or your digital ecosystem within your organization. It goes beyond just using Trello or using Asana. This is an organizational revamp. How do those tools fit with each other? There are a lot of organizations that during the time of lockdown, they invested in almost every tool known to man, with no vision of, okay, which channels are we using for what purpose? Why are we including this tool? Do we have, is this tool already being used in another place? What are the security risks associated with these tools? What are the protocols for our employees? What do we expect from them in using these tools? So that in itself requires a strategy also. Also with that, it comes to thinking about how do you actually ensure that you're getting the quality of engagement you want through these tools, and that you can actually monitor their effectiveness. What's the point of putting in several tools if you can't tell they're actually working for you? And we've seen cases where a lot of organizations are just duplicating without counting the cost. So that's particularly important. So then gig skills, and this is particularly crucial. We've heard so much in recent times about reskilling, and that cannot be stated enough. If you're talking about managing and engaging your remote working team, that's not necessarily your blended workforce, which is a mix of your full-time and the independent. That might not necessarily come naturally to most, especially to business leaders. So we're not just focusing here on what it means to enhance your remote leadership, but it is the needs of independent workers may be very different in some areas to the needs of your full-time staff. You have individuals that prefer more autonomy within their job, who want to work more flexibly and independently while working with your team, and they have very different expectations. So now it's to think about, how can we prepare our staff with both the human skills and the digital skills necessary to allow them to be effective when they're working with different types of workers. You see our little robot here. We mentioned also that we mentioned earlier humans working alongside robots, and even that relationship, quote unquote, needs to be managed. So we call a mixture of the digital and the human skills phygital skills. So here we're talking about how do you build out your agile working capabilities, your digital human skills, your remote leadership and ability to empower and co-work where is necessary, and also your project expertise in different areas. But you can also see those separately as well. And of course, the needs of companies will vary from organization to organization. So that's really thinking about your L&D roadmap. With all of these changes, your L&D roadmap should also be changing and evolving as well. And then our final room is gig thrills. Now, one of the things that we said earlier was that gigsters or a lot of independent workers are not given the due praise that they're required or that they deserve. So one of the things that I've seen as well in my work is that gig workers often feel like an afterthought. They're meant to feel like they're not really a part of the bigger project because they're not there. Or they're treated sometimes like an add-on. One person described themselves as feeling like an app. So it was quite important for us here to make sure we created structures that would allow for that better integration of gig workers as well as the celebration of what they do. So we have here connect, we have here create, and we're talking about the co-creation of projects, making sure gig workers or independent workers feel fully included in that process, though they might not be a full-time member of the company. So thinking about that collaborative process and how do we cultivate a culture of recognition and engagement, but also particularly building out spaces to celebrate. So it sounds very similar to what we've seen with agile working and agile HR, and you can say this particular box tends to highlight that nature of celebrating your wins, and it's very important not just for your full-time employees but also for those independent stakeholders to feel a sense of belonging. If you think about the amount of people that are moving to this type of work, they're becoming more competitive, and then it's really a matter of organizations ensuring that they don't limit their talent lens by treating gig workers poorly. And a lot of the workers that we spoke to, I'm going to bring in our other elements, a lot of the workers that we spoke to said that they won't be working with companies again that have made them feel undervalued. So where companies start to depend on these type of workers, then that becomes a massive issue. And of course, in making sure you're building out these areas and developing this sort of framework and structure, then it's very important also to be managing the nature of your employee well-being through, a lot of these systems and protocols will be created here as well. So this is just a kind of overview. And what we do is we tend to implement various levels of this framework for companies. So for example, if it's a company that's worried about the actual sourcing and onboarding of gig workers and so forth, then we'll help you out in terms of the gig rules. That would be encompassed in the rules. If it's a company that's thinking about their digital infrastructure and how they can really create this in a holistic manner, then that fits the gig tools. So you can see how it fits the different priorities of whole business transformation. So we really need to shift away from this idea of only digital transformation via digital tools. But really, the future of work is still very human. Despite everything we've said about robots, despite more digital working, the human experience is what makes all of this really impactful. And how we improve and enhance that human experience, the digital tools do play a part of that. But that relationship element will also be crucial. So this roadmap really outlines how you can bring the digital and the human side together in your transformation process. And it takes all of this to make a gig home. So, through our framework, it really just identified some of the key factors that are needed in order to really build successful partnerships between these independent contractors, or entrepreneurs as we call them, and organizations, but also the employees that work within those organizations. So when we're thinking about new rules of the road or ways of improving this relationship, then it calls for really thinking again about that human experience. A lot of the things that full-time employees that are bestowed upon full-time employees, a lot of entrepreneurs have those needs as well, and independent workers, but because of the nature of their contract, often organizations may not take responsibility. But then what tends to happen in these projects where organizations bring someone on is that perhaps the project doesn't work out the way that it should. There's conflict of interest or an argument between the company and the person delivering the work. There's a lack of communication because the gig worker can't get through to the company or the people that they need to on time. There's trouble being paid for their services or so forth. So all of these are elements that are typically troublesome, but where you manage this relationship successfully, it's very important to make sure you are meeting the various needs of this element of your blended workforce. Typically, this attention is given to the full-time employees, but it needs to be a balance for everyone in order to really create that sense of inclusion. So we have here clear and realistic objectives. So again, not treating the digital nomad or that independent contractor like an add-on, but a full-fledged member of the team, and making sure that they have everything they need from the get-go in terms of what the company actually requires of them. Flexibility around working style. Well, we know that has definitely, a lot of companies are definitely more open to that. Though some are trying to return to the old normal, but I highly discourage this. That might be my bias. So with regards to also making sure that they have fair contracts in terms of conditions. Remember that quote that was highlighted earlier, we're abusing independent contractors at our own peril. When we look at the percentages in terms of how this workforce is rising, then we're becoming a lot more dependent on independent contractors for work and expertise, especially the best expertise. So ensuring that you offer respectful payment terms and conditions and fair contracts will determine whether or not your company is able to get the skills or the best skills in order to compete effectively in this disruptive age. Reduce complexity when working together. So going back to streamlining your communication channels and making sure everyone is clear on the rules of the road. And more on-the-job support. These persons, they need training and development as well. So what sort of bespoke training might you offer that would be suited to their particular context? So let's say a gig worker, probably a full-time all-day workshop in a particular location might not be suited, but perhaps a particular online platform offered at a discount rate might be something as well. So it's just thinking of different ways to facilitate and to include all types of workers. So this is just to highlight some of those elements again, talking about the tools that are crucial in terms of making sure you can effectively manage gig workers or your blended workforce. So moving away from those, let's say ad hoc contracts, to having more long-term agreements. That creating that feeling of belonging and inclusion. Reviewing your onboarding and induction process. What does that look like for a worker that you will never meet? Physically, that is. And also looking at your digital tools and ecosystems. So that is just an overview of our GigHR framework, and I hope you found it useful. And when it comes to implementing that framework, that can be done in different ways, and that is what we do as a consulting company. We break that framework down for companies, and depending on the specific need, we provide you with a range of services that will help you to implement that. But just before we go, and thank you so much for engaging with our presentation. I probably moved away from this slide a little bit too quick. You can see where you can learn more about the GigHR study and framework right here. But this is becoming a priority just because of the way in which, or it is a priority because of the way in which the world of work has changed. And it's imperative to organizations as they're looking to compete in new ways that they can really benefit from the wider range of skills and talent across the globe. So there's definitely a need to think about our HR system, the current systems that we've been using, and start to question why we've stuck to a certain way of doing things. So hopefully the GigHR framework would provide a roadmap of how you can do that, how you can think of that whole business transformation in order to now really bring your organization a lot further into the future to compete effectively. So thank you for listening, and I've included a short quiz where you can go and test your knowledge on the Gig framework and the blended workforce. I call it the Gig blended workforce quiz. So we have 7 questions here, and if you click on this link, it will take you to those 7 questions, and you can complete our quiz, and you also get a score as well. So let us know how you did when next I speak to you. But thank you so much for listening to our presentation. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope you find the information very useful, and I look forward to engaging with you at the conference and other sessions and otherwise. So don't hesitate to reach out. I am super friendly and love to have a good conversation. So you can find ways to connect with me down here. I'm on LinkedIn. I usually post on LinkedIn a lot, and on Twitter as well. Yeah. And also, if you want to contact me directly with regards to the framework or anything else that I can help with, feel free to reach out at contact@crowdpotential.co.uk. But it has been a pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you more in the conference. So take care. Bye.